The political theater we're witnessing right now isn't just another scandal cycle playing out in Washington. What we're seeing is the structural architecture of American power beginning to reveal itself in ways that even seasoned observers didn't anticipate. When someone who has spent decades navigating the machinery of capital accumulation, real estate development, and media manipulation suddenly finds themselves caught in a web they helped design, we have to ask ourselves what this tells us about the system itself. The irony here runs deeper than most coverage suggests. We're watching someone who understood how to exploit regulatory gaps, how to leverage bankruptcy laws, how to turn debt into assets, now facing the very mechanisms that allowed that exploitation to flourish in the first place. This isn't about individual moral failings, though those exist. This is about a political economy that rewards certain behaviors, creates incentives for deception, and then occasionally demands accountability when the contradictions become too visible to ignore. What's fascinating from an economic standpoint is how this moment exposes the inherent instability in a system where personal enrichment and public responsibility exist in constant tension, where the rules are simultaneously flexible for the powerful and rigid for everyone else. Let me take you through what's actually happening here, because the surface-level narrative that most media outlets are pushing misses the fundamental dynamics at play. We need to understand this moment not as an isolated incident, but as the logical culmination of decades of contradictions within American capitalism and its political superstructure. When we talk about someone falling into a trap, we have to ask ourselves who set that trap, why it exists in the first place, and what it reveals about the system that makes such traps necessary. The American political system has always had this peculiar relationship with wealth and power. We celebrate accumulation. We worship at the altar of the self-made billionaire. We create an entire mythology around individual success. But simultaneously, we maintain this fiction that our democratic institutions exist separately from economic power, that somehow the political realm operates on different principles than the market. This is, of course, a fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually works in a capitalist democracy. The two spheres are not separate. They never have been. They're deeply, inextricably intertwined. What we're witnessing now is what happens when someone who has spent their entire career operating in the gray zones between legal and illegal, between acceptable and scandalous, between private enrichment and public service, suddenly finds that those gray zones are being illuminated. And here's what's crucial to understand. These gray zones exist by design. They're not accidents. They're not oversights in our legal system. They're features of an economic structure that requires a certain flexibility for capital to move, to grow, to accumulate. The very mechanisms that allowed for decades of questionable business practices, tax avoidance strategies, and financial maneuvering are the same mechanisms that now create vulnerability. Think about the contradiction here. We live in a society that tells us entrepreneurship is the highest calling, that bending rules is just being clever, that aggressive tax strategies are simply smart business. We celebrate these qualities. We put people who exhibit them on magazine covers. We give them reality television shows. We elevate them to the highest positions of power. And then, when the political winds shift, when the contradictions become too obvious, when public anger needs to be channeled somewhere, we suddenly discover that maybe these practices weren't so admirable after all. Maybe there were laws being broken. Maybe there was fraud involved. Maybe the line between shrewd business acumen and criminal activity was thinner than we wanted to admit. But let's be clear about something. This isn't really about individual accountability in any deep sense. If it were, we'd be having a very different conversation about the entire structure of American business and politics. We'd be examining how our campaign finance system essentially legalizes bribery. We'd be investigating how the revolving door between corporate boardrooms and government positions creates inherent conflicts of interest. We'd be questioning why financial crimes that destroy millions of lives result in fines, while street crimes result in imprisonment. We'd be asking why the architects of the financial collapse faced no real consequences, while millions lost their homes, their savings, their futures. What's happening instead is more selective. It's theatrical. It's designed to give the appearance of accountability while leaving the fundamental structures untouched. This is how the system maintains legitimacy. It occasionally sacrifices one of its own, creates a spectacle, allows the public to feel that justice is being served, and then continues operating exactly as it did before. The trap, if we want to call it that, isn't really designed to fundamentally change anything. It's designed to relieve pressure, to redirect anger, to make people believe that the institutions are working. Now, let me be specific about what I mean by the perfect trap. What makes this situation particularly revealing is that it exposes the historical record in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. When you're operating in the private sector, you can maintain a certain level of opacity. Business records can be sealed. Deals can be structured through layers of corporate entities. Non-disclosure agreements can silence critics. The public has limited access to the machinery of private enterprise. But when you move from the private sector into public office, especially into the highest public office, that protective layer begins to crack. Suddenly there's scrutiny. There are investigations. There are subpoenas. There are political opponents with resources and motivation to dig into the past. The irony is that the very ambition that drives someone to seek ultimate power creates the conditions for ultimate exposure. If you remain in the private sector, if you stay in your tower counting your money, you might never face this level of examination. But power in capitalism is never satisfied with just economic dominance. It always seeks political expression. It always wants to control the regulatory apparatus, to shape the laws, to influence the judges, to direct the prosecutors. This is rational behavior within the logic of the system. Why wouldn't capital seek to control the state? The state has the power to protect property, to enforce contracts, to subsidize industries, to bail out failed enterprises, to go to war to open markets. Control of the state is the ultimate prize. But here's the contradiction that creates the trap. To achieve that political power in a democracy, even a constrained democracy like ours, you need to submit yourself to a certain level of public scrutiny. You need to campaign. You need to debate. You need to release some information about yourself. You create a public record. You make promises. You take positions. And all of this creates data points, creates contradictions, creates opportunities for your past to be examined in ways that simply don't happen when you're just another real estate developer or media personality. What we're seeing unfold is the collision between someone who operated for decades in a world where money could solve most problems, where lawyers could make things disappear, where the right political donations could ensure favorable treatment, and a political system that, despite all its flaws and corruptions, still has some mechanisms for accountability, still has some institutional memory, still has some capacity to investigate and prosecute. These mechanisms don't work consistently, they don't work fairly, they're absolutely shaped by class and race and wealth, but they exist, and occasionally, under the right circumstances, they activate. The perfect trap aspect comes from the fact that the exposure isn't coming from outside the system. It's coming from within. It's the result of someone reaching so far, grasping for so much power, that they triggered defensive responses from other factions of the elite, from other power centers that felt threatened. This isn't the working class rising up to demand accountability. This isn't a grassroots movement forcing transparency. This is elite conflict playing out through institutional mechanisms. Different sectors of capital, different political factions, different bureaucratic agencies, all have their own interests, their own agendas, their own reasons for wanting to see certain information brought to light. And this is where the analysis needs to go deeper. When we talk about the past being exposed, we're not just talking about individual misdeeds. We're talking about a system of operation that was perfectly normal within certain business circles. Tax avoidance through aggressive accounting, valuation manipulation to secure favorable loans, using bankruptcy strategically to avoid obligations, employing undocumented workers while publicly railing against immigration, making payments to silence embarrassing stories, using shell companies to obscure ownership, mixing personal and business finances. These practices aren't aberrations. They're standard operating procedures for a certain class of operators within American capitalism. What makes this moment significant isn't that these practices existed. Everyone in the relevant circles knew they existed. What's significant is that they're being documented, investigated, and potentially prosecuted. The usual protective mechanisms, the usual ways of making problems disappear, aren't working as effectively. And why? Because the political stakes have become too high. Because too many people are watching. Because the contradictions have become too visible. Because other power centers see an opportunity to weaken a rival. Think about what this reveals about American democracy. We pride ourselves on being a nation of laws, on having institutions that check power, on having mechanisms for accountability. But those mechanisms are highly selective. They activate based on political calculations, based on media attention, based on public pressure, based on conflicts within the elite. They don't activate automatically. They don't activate fairly. A poor person stealing to survive faces immediate, harsh consequences. A wealthy person engaged in systematic fraud might never face any consequences at all, unless they become politically inconvenient, unless they threaten the wrong people, unless they reach too far. This is the trap of success within capitalism. The more successful you are, the more visible you become. The more visible you become, the more vulnerable you are to examination. But the examination is never neutral. It's always political. It's always shaped by power dynamics. The question isn't really whether someone broke laws. In a system with as many laws as ours, where the legal code is so complex that specialists spend entire careers mastering tiny subsets of it, everyone has probably broken some law at some point. The question is, who gets investigated, who gets prosecuted, who gets punished? And those decisions are fundamentally political. What we're watching is a political prosecution in the fullest sense of that term. Not in the sense that the charges are invented or false, but in the sense that the decision to investigate, the decision to prosecute, the decision to pursue accountability is driven by political considerations. In a different political climate, with different people in positions of authority, with different public sentiment, the same actions might be overlooked, might be settled quietly, might never come to light at all. This is how power works. This is how the system maintains itself while occasionally appearing to hold people accountable. And here's what's most important for us to understand as we watch this unfold. The exposure of past actions, the documentation of questionable practices, the potential legal consequences. None of this fundamentally changes the system that made those actions possible, that rewarded those practices, that created the incentives for that behavior. If we really wanted accountability, if we really wanted to address the underlying problems, we'd be having very different conversations. We'd be talking about systemic reform. We'd be questioning the entire structure of money and politics. We'd be examining how tax law is written to benefit the wealthy. We'd be investigating how regulatory agencies are captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate. We'd be confronting how our economic system inherently creates incentives for deception, exploitation, and the concentration of wealth and power. But instead, we get spectacle, we get drama, we get individual focus. We get to watch someone who exemplifies certain aspects of American capitalism face some consequences, and we're supposed to feel that the system is working, that justice is being served, that accountability exists, and maybe, in a limited sense, it does. Maybe there will be some consequences. Maybe there will be some punishment. Maybe the historical record will be documented in ways that inform future generations. But the system itself will continue operating exactly as it has, producing new iterations of the same problems, creating new opportunities for the same kinds of behavior, rewarding the same kinds of actions. The perfect trap isn't really a trap for the individual. It's a trap for all of us, for anyone who believes that focusing on individual accountability is sufficient, for anyone who thinks that prosecuting one person changes the fundamental dynamics of power in American society. The trap is believing that the system is working when it produces occasional spectacles of accountability while leaving the underlying structures completely intact. The trap is mistaking theater for transformation, mistaking individual consequences for systemic change, mistaking the exposure of past actions for any meaningful shift in how power operates in the present. This is what we need to keep in mind as this situation continues to develop. Yes, watch the legal proceedings. Yes, pay attention to what gets revealed. Yes, note the contradictions and the hypocrisy. But never lose sight of the bigger picture. Never forget that the same system that occasionally prosecutes its most visible offenders is the same system that creates the conditions for those offenses in the first place. Never imagine that individual accountability is the same as structural transformation. And never stop asking who benefits from this spectacle, what purpose it serves, and what deeper changes are being avoided while we focus our attention on this particular drama.